Just relax and pay attention.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hieronimus, and our executive producer and research assistants, Laura Kortner. Our engineer is Anita Brockington. Tonight, our guest is Dr. Chet Snow, Mass Dreams of the Future. And, of course, we're concerned about whether or not the future is going to be apocalyptic or is it going to be a spiritual awakening. And, obviously, we are pushing for the spiritual awakening type of thing. And he's with us right now. You there now, Chet?
Yeah, I am. Thanks, Dr. Bob. We were talking about my own progression into what was in the book called the late 1990s. Of course, one has to remember linear time and trying to put dates on something is probably the least accurate part of any of this work. The unconscious, superconscious mind doesn't think in terms of linear time or dates, except for that envelope of where your life is going to be lived or not lived. But what I saw was in this bottom having dropped out of California and the earth changes in the late 1990s, a very apocalyptic, frankly, scenario, but one that seemed to be having a hope in that small communities, particularly people who had psychic abilities, were coming together and using radio and also short, like psychic radio, you might call it, to communicate above and outside of official channels of communication. The media was not particularly helpful in this, but nonetheless, these groups did exist, and that's what I saw. And I just want to comment that, yes, obviously it's clear that particular alternative future, I'll call it, has not happened here. We are not in that reality. It may have spun off into something else. People may have read my book or been sufficiently changed through other means by which they then rejected the earth change scenario. However, the end of that, which is the archetypes that are seen in the book that go beyond that, which are the ones that we're going to talk about in this hour, where people saw an archetype of a space, a sort of space civilization. Some people saw a high-tech but place where the environment was unfriendly and people had to stay inside and be very separated type of environment. And then some people saw what might be called a new age or a kind of a mentally constructed environment where people could actually use collective mental abilities to help maintain in small areas a good environment. And then finally, a throwback or a rustic civilization, survivors and some people who apparently come back to live in an environment that is very reminiscent of the early West in the 19th century, late 19th century, early 1900s Western type civilization, although in different parts of the world. So those are the four archetypes that come forward in the book, and people can read more about, and that was what our research ultimately was based on. My own particular vision and version of my own life has changed, and I didn't live through that apocalypse, although I did end up living in Arizona. We still have blue skies, and we still have, cars that run, and there's food in the supermarkets, although we did have a run on it like everybody. But maybe the means changed. Maybe this pandemic and the things that are coming along from that are pushing us just with a different engine towards some of these same archetypes. That's what I'd like to get at.
Okay. Well, I did want to mention something and just ask you if that would have helped any. I was involved with several groups of individuals that were sending light to the West Coast for long periods of time.
Yes, we did that here too.
There were so many groups doing that. I was just wondering if any of that really made a difference, because things really changed.
I think, yes, the answer, to me, the hopeful answer, and I am an optimist, by the way, I do believe humanity will progress. We may have some apocalyptic here's and there's and some bumps along the way, you might call it, but I do believe we will progress. Yes, I would say that it has had an effect, and people coming together and using what has been called the Maharishi effect has been part of our reality building and part of our environmental consciousness today, as I was talking about the bio-relativity. We have had a generation that people have so much more got into things like yoga, things like meditation,
Indeed.
things like past life therapy or other therapies, coming together and working on themselves, that it has been like leaven in the loaf, you might say. It doesn't have to be a majority of people. It simply has to be a critical mass of a minority. And so, yes, Bob, I would think we have accomplished that. That's my hope. However, it's like these archetypes are pretty strongly anchored in humanity. I get asked oftentimes, why didn't I write another book in the 90s? Because I did more research into the 90s, and one of the main reasons was that I found the same answers coming up again and again, same archetypes.
Oh, good.
And so I said, well, why am I going to write a book simply to say, hey, here, these archetypes still exist in the mass consciousness of humanity, at least in the Western civilization. And I wasn't about to go to India or China or somewhere where I didn't speak the language and know enough about the people to try to see what another different culture might think, what was in their mass consciousness. You'd have to have somebody from that culture do that. So that was my decision. That plus I fell in love and got married instead. And I realized that, at least in my consciousness, marriage and writing, research writing, don't go hand in hand.
Well, yeah, they don't. They don't.
I'm a pretty isolated and what's the right word? Individual when I'm in my writing research mode. I'm not very pleasant, and I wanted to be with my wife, frankly. So we created a different reality for us, which I think we've been successful at. I'm happy about. But I'm coming back to the pandemic because this is another way to push humanity into some of these archetypes, particularly the high-tech one, which I talk about as Type 3 in Mass Dreams of the Future, one where people essentially are almost afraid of each other, and they are living in domes or underground, and the environment around them with this bio-relativity concept has turned sour.
Oh.
Now, that's not true of our world today. I think we'll get through this virus thing, frankly, but it might be a rehearsal. The negative part of me says it could be something that is a precursor to something more. I don't know. But I think we need to be on our guard that in all of the precautions that we need to take right now to to stop this thing and to find some vaccine or cure or whatever it's going to be that's going to help us through it, that we don't give up our essential humanity, which is that we care about our fellow human beings and that we want to reach out to them and physically touch the people that we have emotional responses to. I would hate to live in a world which I've heard projected by some of the medical people today, in which shaking hands is impossible, hugging is impossible. That's not where I want to live.
Of course not.
And I don't think we have to do it. I think we could get through this thing without that coming to pass. But it is a possible alternative future. Let me put it that way.
Well, thank you for getting into that. Now, of the 2,500 case studies collected by yourself, Dr. Leo Sprinkle, God bless that man, and Dr. Helen Wambach regarding mass dreams of the future, tell our audience about the year 2100 AD. What do the participants see in 2100?
Right. Well, 2100 was, of course, the first of the two future eras that Dr. Wambach agreed would be far enough ahead that the unconscious mind would be willing to visualize it, would be willing to see what might be each person's individual future experience. Let's put it that way. The first thing I would say, and this I make clear in my book, of the people that we progressed, only 5 to 6% came back saying that they could see themselves alive in that time frame. And that's pretty small. Now,
That sure is.
in the past, it's about 80 to 90% of people can go to past lives. So one of the things, there's always a little bit of reluctance. Some people just have a kind of mind that won't permit them to do this work, and that's just how they are. They may have some trauma that's very deeply hidden and they can't face, and so they won't go there. And that could be applied to the future. But you wouldn't find a 90% response rate down to a 5 to 6% response rate. The second thing that made us believe that we're talking about a significant population drop is that when we took people ahead to 2400, 12 to 15% could visualize living there farther ahead. I mean, further than we would think that your mind might make something up. If it were just your imagination, wouldn't you think it'd be easier to imagine living in 2100 than 2500? Just as it's logical to think yes, because it's closer to us.
Yes, of course.
But twice as many people were able to come back and visualize being alive in that later period, which indicates if there's a big population drop between now and let's say 21, and I'm guessing it's 2150. We pushed it back, in my opinion. If that's the case, we've pushed it back because linear time is malleable. Collectively, our collective consciousness can work and push dates particularly back. I do believe that. Anyway, so therefore, these people that came back and saw these archetypes are pretty few and far between when you think about it. A lot of people were essentially on a vacation. They weren't here. They didn't have to worry about it. Many of them then came back later on. But I myself told Dr. Wambach when she said something about 2150, you know what? Being in space and conquering space in a physical body doesn't interest me. I'm out of here. So I talk about that in the book in one of the chapters. So our first archetype was the people in 2100 who saw themselves in some kind of space environment. Interestingly enough, it was limited to our solar system. They were either on space stations or a colony on the moon or Mars, or they were some kind of a space pilot who may have been based on Earth but routinely did shuttle work to these other places. None of the places that were the space colonies were totally self-sufficient. All of them, people saw that they had a need for Earth resupplies, and so there was no terraforming of another planet. That seems to be beyond our capability in the next 150 years. But that they did have quite interesting experiences, and they had many common things in common, such as clothing, food, a lot of the paste and packaged things, of course. Some of them saw hydroponic gardens and where they were, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was the first archetype. Somehow there is a gradual going out into our solar system by humanity, even if the population had declined. The second archetype was, I called it the New Age archetype, and it was here on the planet. This was the smallest one. I think it was only 10 or 12% of the people who were able to go somewhere and saw something. These were people who were living in really very nice environments. It's certainly the one that I would most be interested in, and they were involved in some sort of artistic or educational pursuit, something to do with culture, education, artistry, music, that kind of thing. And particularly when we asked questions, I kind of worked on this myself toward the last set of workshops that I did in the 80s. I would ask them things about if they could talk about their own mental development. And it became clear that these were people who were living in small communities of like mind, cooperating, and actually, you might say they had something like the Star Trek mind meld. They could meld their minds together and create things and make things happen. So, in a sense, they were creating the environment they were living in without it being a physical dome, but they were doing it through the power of the mind. What Edgar Cayce called the mind is the builder.
Mind is the builder. And we're going to take a break right about now. Sorry we leaned a little bit too far into this break period, but we better move into it now. Dr. Chet Snow is our guest, Masterings of the Future, and we will return to discuss a lot more interesting stuff. I'm telling you, this is just the beginning. I wish we could have you on for 3 or 4 hours. Okay, break time.
This is Leo Sprinkle speaking. I'm a counseling psychologist in Laramie, Wyoming, interested in UFO research and reincarnation research. You're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus.
Dr. Leo, boy, I haven't heard his voice in so many years. What a fine soul. What a fine soul. You knew him very well, didn't you, Chet?
I did. He worked closely with Helen, and I was privileged to go up and speak at a couple of his conferences, although the whole UFO thing was never really my bag, as it were. I was certainly aware of it, and I did have a number of contactees who did regression work and realized, came to understand what that was happening with them. But yes, fine man.
Oh, sure. Dedicated. I mean, this man would work. Just never stop working.
That's very true.
It's just, when you see people like this, and when you get a chance to know and talk to them, God bless your soul, you really get hope, because these individuals, in my opinion, are the ones that will be the ones that make the breakthroughs for us. Now, so we were talking about what do the participants see in 2100? You explained that, and that was I think you mentioned something like some early. Did you mention sparse population? And
yes, well, there had been a big population drop between when the progressions were taking place in the 1980s and this 2100, 2150 period when people saw themselves coming back. So I mentioned the first two archetypes. There's two more. I just want to go through them rather quickly.
Please.
The third one was the majority of the people, and that was the one that I call the high-tech people. And in a way, we see the seeds of that in our civilization coming right now. It was the one where everything was on screens, where people had communication devices that we didn't know what they were back in the 1980s, but yes, you'd call them, I suppose, iPads or iPhones or something today, that people saw themselves living in protected environments, that somehow the outside environment in most cases was not very friendly. It was hostile. A lot of people saw that. The water problems, environment problems, desertification, and so people went into a technological response. And that was the third type. That was the majority of our subjects saw that, who came back in that time period. I go into some detail about their food and their clothing and how they interacted with each other. It's interesting that and the space people were the only two environments I saw that had any violent deaths.
Yeah.
The other two didn't seem to have violent deaths. They were either natural or something accidental in some cases. So this was type 3, and then the type 4 was the I called them the rustics or the primitives, and it's kind of strange, but these people knew they were in the future. They were in parts of the world that we wouldn't associate with the vistas that they saw today, such as one lady who saw herself in what was now Greenland, and yet it was green. It was a temperate climate, or northern Canada, and it was temperate climate. and they saw a civilization that was, I would say, bouncing back from some great ecological and population change having taken place before them. They were like the second generation again after that. And then there were just a few cases where there were, I called them the urban survivors. I think there were only 3 or 4 in the whole study that we did, but I wanted to put their cases in the book because I thought this is something that we need to, it's a wake-up call. And one was in Moscow, one was in New York, and I think the third one was in Cairo. And they were living in what had been big cities, but were now reduced to rubble and a handful of survivors under martial law of some kind, and not a very pleasant environment to be in. Those were the final case, the 4B I call them. Anyway, those are the archetypes, and so one can think of them as being alternatives. One can think of them as being all at the same time, which is how people saw them, and yet we have a choice. That's why I put very clearly in the subtitle of my book, do we go for an apocalypse, or do we go for some spiritual awakening where we learn to cooperate and we learn to be together and to face things together and to be collegial again rather than competitive, just competition. And we have a choice, and the choice is in our time. The choice isn't in the future. The choice is now. Which of these archetypes are we going to go toward? And so, like I said before the break, one of the aspects of this was earth changes. We still are faced with earth changes. I don't know if you know this, but just March 31st, there was a 4.8 earthquake in the Yellowstone caldera, which was the first biggest major earth movement there since February of 1980. And February of 1980 preceded Mount St. Helens by 4 months.
That's right.
And so is that a problem? I don't know, but I'm just telling your listeners, well, wouldn't that be the case? We have a pandemic and suddenly we have a volcano erupt.
Well,
I don't like to think of that, but I'm just saying this is it's the means to get to the archetype. That's what I'm trying to put forward. And we have to consciously and collectively work on changing those means. And we're given that opportunity with this virus, in my opinion.
I think that's an excellent idea. I don't know if you saw the story from Bloomberg Business Week that Miami will be underwater soon. But
no, I didn't see that.
No, I'll send you a copy of the whole thing. It's about
well, I did a future map back based on these earth changes and mass streams and what people saw, and definitely the southeastern Florida was all gone.
Yep, it's going to be all gone. Right? We've been Excuse me, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Some of Florida was left, but not much.
That's correct. Yes. And I'm sorry about that. I've got so many good friends down there, and that same thing out in California. Is California, I from the book, it looks as if California and, Southern California and Northern California are going to have a pretty rough time.
Islands.
Yeah, they become islands.
Islands. That's what people saw.
Yeah.
More than once. Yeah, and water actually coming in as far as western Arizona.
Jeez, oh yes. One of the first thing about Miami, though, is they're saying is that the drinking water will go first, and that you know what that means. Whoa!
I understand why it would, because the water, the salt water table will rise.
Yes, indeed.
And it's pretty close to the surface already.
You can see that. So they're showing photographs of it.
Just to go on the other side, because I am an optimist, I will die an optimist. Right now, with what's happened with this virus, I'm sure you've seen the maps because it's been all the media of China and even of the United States. The industrial pollution into the atmosphere has radically gone down.
Yes.
Since February, since January.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something I don't think too many people know. We have also detected, because there are lots of scientists out looking at these things, that the seismic activity, which can be directly related to human economic activity, which is drilling and even trucks and cars in freeways, that has calmed down in California and other places in the United States as a result of no activity going on. The freeways are empty. They actually have found and seen that the amount of small seismic pre-earthquake activity has diminished in the last month here in the United States.
Good going.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, yes, it is.
And that's positive.
And I think we'll probably see a lot more of that. Tell us about the... Oh, no. I don't want to get into that one yet. Have so many other questions here. I don't know if we're going to get to them. So maybe we better do this one, though. Number 10. How do you think apocalyptic worldviews shape present and future? We're talking about that now. But what would your conclusions be?
Well, I guess my conclusion would be that these archetypes are pretty firmly embedded in human consciousness. And to me, they're not negative in themselves. We have alternatives, and we need, again, I think, I don't want to be Pollyanna. I'm not a Pollyanna either. I'm a realist on these things, but I think we need, how can I say it best? We need to get back to human kindness.
You hit the nail right on the head. That is the key.
Human kindness.
That's the key.
To your neighbor. Help somebody out locally. Go to a restaurant and get their takeout or do something in your neighborhood with vulnerable people to help them. That doesn't mean hugging them, because that's not what we can do right now. But it means maybe send out virtual hugs. I don't know. But there are things that everybody can do in their neighborhood. My wife and I love to walk we're in a residential neighborhood, a residential street. We love to walk on our street just about this time of the day, in fact. And we often see our neighbors staying, 6 to 10 feet apart, but we have a chance to chat with them for a few minutes and find out, is everything okay, and, blah, blah, blah. This is the kind of thing, we can't just separate ourselves and put ourselves in electronic boxes. That would be the biggest negative outcome of the current crisis, in my opinion. The second biggest negative outcome would be if we allow ourselves to wall each other off, stop our borders, so that the United States becomes 50 individual separate states again instead of a nation. That would be very disturbing to me. The idea that the federal government can't help states somehow, that's disturbing to me. That's what it's there for. It's to help the states, and the states are to help the neighborhoods. That's how I see it, at least. These are the kind of things we need. It's not about raising new social demands. I think if we do too much of that, we're going to have a problem. We need to be kind to people where they are right now, how they are right now, and help each other through whatever's going on.
Absolutely. Yes, indeed. That is, I think maybe we can all become, in a certain sense, like Jesus Christ.
Well, at least the Christ consciousness, right? We don't have to be the person.
That's right.
But we need to operate the consciousness. I think that's the thing.
That is.
There's a concept in the South American native spirituality that human beings are bridge people. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you've heard this.
Yeah, oh, yes.
That we're bridge people. We're bridges between spirit and matter. And that is our unique contribution, that we can, at the same time, have consciousness that can go to spirit and visualize and envision spirit, and that at the same time we can come back and be matter and work in the material world. One of the things that comes up many times in Dr. Wambach's work and also in this book is we talk about one of the questions we asked people, because we wanted to get an idea of what they saw, is, you see a bright light. What is that light? What is light? And light is unique in the physical and material world because it is energy and pattern matter at the same time. It's waves and material, waves. And this is what human beings are. That's why we are light.
That's
in a
right.
sense.
We are light. As a matter of fact,
And
yeah,
no one else, no other material being follows that role. And why do they not? Because they have instinct. They don't have will. Human beings have free will in that respect. We can choose. That's why I say the choice is ours. It's our choice. We will create our future. We are the future by the choices we make every day. We are that bridge.
And the choice I'm forced to make right now is another break here on 21st Century Radio with our guest, Dr. Chet Snow, Mass Dreams of the Future. And all links, you can reach him at chetsnow.com. All links are at 21stcenturyradio.com, and our archives are posted for free. I think we're about the only ones doing this now, for free on iTunes and YouTube.
Hi, this is Linda Moulton Howe, reporter and editor of EarthFiles.com. You are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus, exploring issues beyond the 6 o'clock news.
Linda Moulton Howe, we used to call her LMH. I talked to her a couple months ago, but boy, we haven't had her on the air for quite a long time. Linda Moulton Howe. You know Linda Moulton Howe, don't you?
Oh, yes.
What a fine person. Boy, she a hard worker.
Very much so. Yep.
Very strong woman. Very strong.
Yes, that's also true.
Yeah.
And someone who is a pit bull to get to the truth.
That's for sure. She does not let go, and thank heaven she...
That's it.
Right.
Linda's one of the shining voices looking for truth that I know in our world today, so I think it's great.
Well, there is something, I want to mention this to our listeners. There is one part of it, and I picked up from your book, was man's answer to everything has been power. Power of money, power of position, power of wealth, power of this, power of that, or the other. This says, and you note here, this has never been God's way, and will never be God's way, period. Unfortunately, we have a party that does not necessarily think that, and that's causing serious trouble from the standpoint of understanding how this power, this kind of power, could destroy us. That's my point. And obviously, I don't want us destroyed. Do you think
Yes, yeah. I think that obviously when you translate human endeavor into politics, you have to talk about power, because that's how people define political relationships, unfortunately, but it is how they define them. And I don't know if one party over another party is better or worse. I don't like to go there. I have my own personal feelings, and however, that's my private world. But again, I think we can find men and women of faith and good. How can I put it best? But that have good souls in all parties, or practically all parties. And yes, they will be tempted. Everyone is tempted, but hopefully they will put the country first, the people first, and then their own particular advantage second. I don't know if that's perhaps pie in the sky. One thing I would say to people, if I had to say something politically, would be, don't put all your eggs in one basket and think only of the presidential election. America is a federation, and we have state and local officials that have actually still a lot of responsibility and power, if you want to call it that, and that can be power for good. We here in Arizona had an election whereby the Secretary of State changed parties. And I'm not going to go into which party was what party, but it doesn't matter. The Secretary of State changed parties, and suddenly our election for 2020 is going to be much better run, simply because the people who had been in power, absolute power corrupts, and it corrupts you absolutely, had been in power too long. I've always been in favor of changing out parties after time. Our founders didn't like parties at all. In fact, they never wanted to have political parties.
That's right.
That came, as a human aspect to it. But what I'm saying is, like, our Secretary of State determines how elections are held. And that's an elected office in almost every state in the union. I think it is in all the states. Anyway, I know it is in Arizona. And if we could get secretaries of state who would abide by not only the law and the power, but also by the Constitution and by the law, and open up the polls with this virus thing, we're going to have to do some very, what's the right word, experimental work this year for 2020, because I don't see how we can have people congregating in polling places, especially when there are too few of them, and standing 6 feet apart, for 12, 15, 20 hours at a time. We have the technology to change that, but we need to get the political will to do it. And so, to me, it's in every single state of the union, the Secretary of State has that role, and we need, as citizens, to, influence the Secretaries of State to do a better job and to adapt each state to the realities of this being able to get together or not get together and stay apart if you have to stay distant from people ahead of the November election. So it's not just the president that's going to need to be worked on. It's going to be the whole system, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
That sounds correct. Now, the universal law of karma is that we reap the results of what we have sown. Apparently, according to Bio-relativity, the more we sow discord and violence, and you mentioned this a little earlier last hour, they are polluting our emotional atmosphere. The greater natural ecological pollution we will have to endure in the future. And our dear friend Edgar Casey directly linked violent sunspot activity to preceding outbursts of human anger, jealousy, hate, and animosity. Would you please comment on what might it mean to the USA in the near future?
Well, I would say that we need to be very careful. We clearly have sowed some not too nice seeds. We need to, again, come back to human kindness and work on that. I do think Casey is right in what he said. Remember, ultimate reality is unity, and the unity is physical and spiritual together. Now, we live in the physical world where those two things get separated, and it's been done deliberately so that we can have progress, so we can have time to adapt and to progress. But if we don't spend our time in progressing, well, then we can also regress. That's free will. That's the aspect of will. And when we only see the half-full cup, or when we only see another person's faults as opposed to seeing their values, then that's a problem. It's just like the whole question of truth. Truth has become almost a what's the right word? A rare commodity these days, an endangered species, I would say. Mm-hmm. And we hear so many lies so often, and I put it in part to advertising, but it's not just advertising. It's become almost like you expect to hear lies then. And when you expect to hear the lies, that's going to pollute the environment and pollute the atmosphere, and ultimately could lead to the Earth changes that are foreseen in mass streams of the future, just coming along 30, 40 years later than they were originally predicted.
That's what a little bit I'm afraid of, because
looking
at the words...
In that aspect, I am not entirely positive. I think that we may go through some apocalyptic scenario in order to get us to the positive progression that we need to get to.
Yes.
Don't say we have to, but I think it's a very real alternative, a very real possibility.
Well, that's why, of course, the elevating of consciousness is kind of key to making a different world, because we'll be living in a different world that way.
Well, and not only us today, but who we are in the future. That's what I think people need to come to some realization. When you think that you've just got one shot at this and then it's all over, you don't think there's going to be consequences. That's what karma teaches us about.
Yeah.
There are consequences to what we say, what we do, what we think, and we hold on to things a lot, and yet that too has consequences. We may think that this future is not going to concern us, but if the work from Dr. Wambach and myself and others progressing people into the future is true, well, guess what? It does concern us directly, and what we have sown in the past is what we're living in today. And it will be true, what we're sowing now, we will be living in tomorrow. Again, we're that bridge.
I'd also like to ask this question. Is physical death as unpleasant as we fear it to be?
Our experience, Dr. Wambach's and mine and others who've done regression work, and all of Dr. Moody's work with the near-death experience, lead me to say no, it's not. There are conditions under which death can be difficult. It's true. Usually, those involved are attempting to avoid it. And sometimes that's a good thing. You know, don't just give up. I would say fight for what you feel you need to be doing and are here for. But I think that one of our problems in our current society has become we have such a strong medical model. Doctors are not taught. They're taught all the ways to keep us alive. They're not taught about what the purpose and function of life is about.
That's for sure.
And they have very strong, thoughts, and they feel that they have lost a person, or they have failed somehow, or they have been defeated, and yet that is not how our ancestors thought of these things. Even in relatively recent times, death was not something that was terribly. It was feared. It wasn't something. Nobody likes separation. And yes, there is a truth that the ego part of the personality may disintegrate, may not be here. And yes, who wants to die in pain and suffering? I agree with all of that. But the truth is that when people have gone through death, either in past experiences or in a near-death experience, almost inevitably they come out saying, wow, that was so different than what I believed it would be.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so I think that we have to, and maybe that's the one thing this pandemic is putting us up against, is that we will have to deal with more death than we're used to on a larger scale, temporarily anyway. And again, to me, the most troubling aspect of what we're doing is that we are forcing people to die alone, and
yes,
we're not giving other people any chance to have a funeral. My wife lost a relative fairly recently, quite an elderly person, blah, blah, blah. And the main thing that bothers the family is they can't bury them. They had to be buried, with just a priest and alone out in the cemetery. And that's somehow we've got to work that out.
Obviously, we do.
Because the human aspect is that commemorating a person and their life and celebrating it is essential to our humanity and to our elders.
Well, you note that the concept of reincarnation of the soul is among humanity's oldest religious beliefs and found in virtually all spiritual traditions. That is so important. How is reincarnation found in the Christian spiritual tradition?
Well, it is in the Christian spiritual tradition, and in fact, it was even in the Bible, in the New Testament. There's a whole aspect where Jesus says John the Baptist was Elijah. And so it's been written around, but reincarnation, or the pre-existence of the soul, that is to say that the soul exists before the physical body exists, is something that was taken out by Emperor Justinian in the 6th century because he didn't like the idea that maybe he would have to come back or his wife would have to come back and face their sins and face the consequences. He didn't like karma. The interesting thing is, and I'm sure you must know the history of this, the Pope actually opposed it. And so underneath in Roman Catholic doctrine, there is really no condemnation of reincarnation. It's just not talked about.
Well,
Only bishops and above are allowed to know about it.
Yes.
It was considered to be something that would not help the people.
I know. And yet it helped. It is the greatest help as far as I'm concerned. It's one of the greatest helps.
Of course it is, but let's put it in another way. It would not help control the people.
Yeah. Well,
I mean,
what?
Because if you have reincarnation, think of it this way: if you have reincarnation, well, okay, what you're doing and thinking and acting is going to have a consequence. How does that sit with the idea that you can, on your deathbed, suddenly, give your soul to Jesus, blah blah blah, and He will take everything away?
Well, with that, we are out of time. Goodness gracious, Chet, this went so fast. It did.
It's been a pleasure.
Well, it's 30 years ago we got together. Oh, we're going to say goodbye. Dr. Zohara next week on 21st Century Radio.